Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into Phyllis Dean's incredible book, The First Industrial Revolution. But look, we're not just going to rattle off a bunch of dry economic statistics here. Instead, we're taking a sociocultural approach. We really want to figure out how society, our environment, and human life itself were completely rewired by industrialization. So let's dive right in with a massive question. How exactly did humanity escape pre-industrial poverty? For the vast majority of human history, poverty wasn't some rare exception, it was the absolute rule. Escaping that trap required a shift so massive, it literally changed the fabric of our daily existence. And that brings us to Dean's renowned study. What makes her analysis an absolute game changer is that she goes way beyond that traditional narrative you always hear, the whole lone inventors and their steam engines thing. Instead, she forces us to focus on the human experience. We're talking shifting social classes, staggering environmental costs, and the harsh realities faced by the actual working poor who powered this whole machine. Here is our roadmap for today. We're breaking this down into 4 parts. First, the pre-industrial world. Second, causes of the revolution. Third, the new social order. And finally, the price of progress. Let's start with part 1, the pre-industrial world, and look at what life was actually like before the factories took over. Take a look at Gregory King's famous table from 1688. This tracks the income and expenses of English families, and what's really fascinating here is the incredibly rigid social structure it reveals. Sure, you've got your temporal lords and baronets right up at the top, but the overwhelming majority of people are freeholders, farmers, laboring people, and cottagers. This was a strictly agrarian, deeply vulnerable society where your social and economic role was basically locked in from birth. And honestly, that agrarian baseline was just incredibly fragile. Back in the mid-18th century, the population of England and Wales was hovering right around 7 million. Dean points out this was a completely stagnant economy. Historically, whenever the population started to creep up, it was brutally checked by a spike in the death rate. A bad harvest literally meant famine. A disease outbreak could wipe out an entire region. There was zero surplus and absolutely no safety net. Humanity was caught in this relentless natural cycle of mere subsistence. So, moving to part 2. Causes of the revolution. What were the specific bottlenecks and sparks that forced a break from that cycle? Well, pre-industrial England was what we call a wood and water economy. Wood was used for absolutely everything: buildings, ships, machinery, and most importantly, fuel. But as Dean points out, wood was running out, and fast. To put this into perspective, a single large blast furnace needed 7,000 acres of woodland just to keep running. They were quite literally running out of trees. So this extreme environmental bottleneck forced a massive technological pivot to a coal and iron economy. Coal gave them abundant, deep earth fuel, and iron let them build durable, mass production machinery that wouldn't just rot or burn down. But here's the thing, coal and iron by themselves weren't enough. The revolution needed a perfect storm of preconditions. First up, a demographic boom provided a massive new labor force. Second, an agricultural revolution created the food surplus needed to feed all those people who were no longer out in the fields. Third, commercial expansion and overseas trade brought in necessary capital. And fourth, they built a massive new canal infrastructure. This was absolutely crucial because it allowed them to move heavy, bulky coal straight from the mines into the towns, breaking that fuel famine once and for all. Okay, part 3. The new social order. Because once those economic pieces clicked into place, the entire fabric of society started to warp. 18 million. That was the staggering population of England and Wales by 1851. In basically a single century, the population more than doubled. Just to ground this in reality, between 1841 and 1851 alone, 1.8 million people were squeezed into large urban towns. The sheer scale of this demographic explosion is just mind-blowing. And this massive migration totally rewired everyday life. We're talking about the absolute death of the self-subsistent family unit. In the old rural setup, families worked together. Their lives were dictated by seasonal rhythms in the sun. They were essentially self-employed. If times got tough, you could spin a little extra wool or forage. But the new urban proletariat? Entirely different story. These workers were now completely dependent on a cash wage. Their days were dictated by rigid machine hours, working year-round, day and night. The traditional economic ties of the family were shattered as individuals had to go sell their labor to this huge impersonal factory system. And the reality of this new labor force was just brutal. Early textile factories systematically absorbed pauper children from as young as 5 years old. Women and children were highly sought after because they were cheaper to hire. The work was incredibly regimented, driven by the relentless, nonstop pace of steam power. And maybe the most terrifying part? The old safety nets of the village parish were completely gone. If an urban worker lost their job during an economic slump, they didn't just have a lean winter, they faced immediate, absolute destitution. Let's see how all this builds into our final section, Part 4, the price of progress, and specifically, the human fallout. If we look at the macro level, the success was undeniable. Britain became the workshop of the world. GDP soared, export markets exploded, and a very comfortable new middle class of merchants and industrialists emerged. But down on the micro level, the suffering was severe. These new cities were completely unequipped for the population boom. While the nation was generating unprecedented wealth, Dean describes how thousands of people in London survived as mudlarks. They were literally scavenging in the raw sewage of rivers just to find scraps of coal or cigar ends to sell, just to avoid starving to death. To really grasp this era, there's this visceral quote from historians J.L. and Barbara Hammond that Dean highlights. They wrote, "The towns had their profitable dirt, their profitable slums, their profitable smoke. The new factories and the new furnaces were like the pyramids, telling of man's enslavement rather than of his power." I mean, wow. It perfectly captures how the environment itself, the air, the water, the living conditions, was entirely degraded and exploited in this singular, relentless pursuit of industrial profit. So what this all boils down to is a massive sociocultural paradox. Yes, industrialization was the engine that ultimately let humanity escape historical poverty. But for the working class of the 18th and 19th centuries, that material progress came at an incredibly heavy cost. As the philosopher John Stuart Mill pointed out back then, it was highly questionable if all these mechanical inventions had actually lightened the day's toil for any human being. They traded the vulnerability of agrarian harvest failures for the squalor, disease, and relentless toil of the urban slum. Sure, they might have had access to cheaper cotton cloth, but they paid for it with grueling hours and a profound loss of personal dignity. Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. When we look around at the affluent, modern societies we live in today, societies built entirely on the foundations of this first industrial revolution, we have to ask ourselves, does the incredible material wealth of the modern era actually justify that immense initial loss of the natural environment and human dignity? It is a deeply complex historical balance sheet, and honestly, it's one that developing nations are still actively trying to navigate right now. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope it leaves you with a whole lot to think about.